Welcome to the 20th Internationales Literatur Festival Berlin. I'm Rebecca Rukeyser, and today I have the tremendous pleasure of speaking with Carmen Maria Machado, the author of the short story collection, Her Body and Other Parties, and the focus of today's conversation, the brilliant form-shifting experimental memoir, In the Dream House, which tells a story, a harrowing account of queer intimate partner violence. A little bit about what the memoir, how the memoir is structured. This account is told through, I think it's 141 chapters. Each of them is driven by a specific narrative trope. So there'll be Dream House as American Gothic, Dream House as picaresque, Dream House as lesbian pulp novel, etc. And I think we should start with Carmen reading. Can you pick a selection?
Yes, absolutely. My pleasure to do so. All right. Oh my goodness, it's been so long since I've read. Dream House as luck of the draw. Part of the problem was, as a weird fat girl, you felt lucky. She did what you'd wished a million others had done, looked past arbitrary markers of social currency and seen your brain and ferocious talent and quick wit and pugnacious approach to assholes. When you started writing about fatness a long time ago in your live journal, a commenter said to you that you were pretty and smart and charming, but as long as you were zaftig, you'd never have your choice of lovers. You remember feeling outrage and then processing the reality, the practicality of what he'd said. You were so angry at the world. You wondered when she came along if this was what most people got to experience in their lives. A straight line from want to satisfaction, desire manifested and satisfied in reasonable succession. This had never been the case before. It had always been fraught. How many times had you said, if I just looked a little different, I'd be drowning in love. Now you got to drown without needing to change a single cell. Lucky you. Dream House as Bluebeard. Bluebeard's greatest lie was that there was only one rule. The newest wife could do anything she wanted, anything, as long as she didn't do that single arbitrary thing, didn't stick that tiny inconsequential key into that tiny inconsequential lock. But we all know that was just the beginning, a test. She failed and lived to tell the tale, as I have. But even if she'd passed, even if she'd listened, there'd have been some other request, a little larger, a little stranger. And if she'd kept going, kept allowing herself to be trained like a corset fanatic, pinching her waist smaller and smaller, there'd have been a scene where Bluebeard danced around with the rotting corpses of his past wives clasped in his arms, and the newest wife would have sat there mutely, suppressing growing horror, swallowing the egg of vomit that bobbed behind her breastbone. And then later, another scene which he did unspeakable things to the bodies, women, they'd once been women, and she just stared dead into the middle distance, seeking some purgatory where she could live forever. Some scholars believe that Bluebeard's Bluebeard is a symbol of its supernatural nature, easier to accept than being brought to heel by a simple man. But isn't that the joke? He can be simple, and he doesn't have to be a man. Because she hadn't blinked at the key and its conditions, hadn't paused when he told her her footfalls were too heavy for his liking, hadn't protested when he fucked her while she wept, hadn't declined when he suggested that she stop speaking, hadn't said a word when he left bruises on her arms, hadn't scolded him for speaking to her like she was a dog or a child, hadn't run screaming down the path from the castle into the nearest village, pleading with someone to help, help, help. It made logical sense that she sat there and watched him spinning around the body of wife number 4, its decaying head flopping backward on a hinge of flesh. This is how you are toughened, the newest wife reasoned. This is where the tenacity of love is practiced, its tensile strength, its durability. You are being tested and you are passing the test. Sweet girl, sweet self, look how good you are. Look how loyal. Look how loved. And then I'll do one more. Dream house as appetite. You make a mistake early on, though you don't know it at the time. You admit to her that you are constantly nursing low-grade crushes on many people in your life. Nothing acted on, just that you find many people attractive and do your best to surround yourself with funny, smart minds, and the result is a gooey, lovely space somewhere between philia and eros. You've been this way as long as you can remember. You've always found this quirk of your personality to be just that, a quirk, and she laughs and says she's charmed by it. Over the course of your relationship, she will accuse you of fucking or wanting to fuck or planning to fuck the following people: your roommate, your roommate's girlfriend, dozens of your friends, the Clarion class you haven't even met yet, a dozen of her friends, not a few of her colleagues at Indiana, her ex-girlfriend, her ex-boyfriend, your ex-boyfriends, several of your teachers, the director of your MFA program, several of your students, one of your doctors, and in perhaps the most demented moment of this exercise, her father. Also an untold litany of strangers, people on the subway and in coffee shops, waiters at restaurants, store clerks and grocery store cashiers and librarians and ticket takers and janitors and museum goers and beach sleepers. The problem is that denial sounds like confession to her, so the burden of proof is forced upon you. To show that you have not been fucking those people, you become adept at doing searches on your phone, providing evidence you haven't been in contact with anyone. You stop talking about a promising student in one of your classes because she becomes fixated on the idea that you have a crush on a 19-year-old who has just learned how to balance exposition and scene. One day, as she rubs her fingers over you and you close your eyes in pleasure, she grabs your face and twists it toward her. She gets so close to you, you smell something sour on her breath. Who are you thinking about, she says. It's phrased like a question, but it isn't. Your mouth moves, but nothing comes out, and she squeezes your jaw a little harder. Look at me when I fuck you, she says. You pretend to come.
Thank you. Reading that, you get a keen sense of the fact that there is a sort of fragmentation already in such a narrative of abuse. But I wanted to start us off by talking about sort of the relationship of formal play to the subject matter and how you came up, how you decided on the genres that you ultimately chose. What was the starting point of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for years, I was trying to write some version of this book, or at least write about the events that take place in this book. And I was really struggling. As any writer knows, sometimes you're trying to do a thing and it's just not taking, it's not catching fire, and you're like frustrated and like returning to it over and over, and there's just not a way, it's just not working. And so I had that happen for a very long time, where I read something and it would just be really bad, you know, and I'd be like, oh, this is terrible, and then I would just like put it aside. And that was just the case for years. And then I actually had this very weird experience where I was actually, so I had at that point moved away from Iowa City, Iowa, which is where I went to grad school, where we went to grad school, and where the events, some of the events of the book took place, not all of them, but some of them. And I went back to teach at this summer camp for young people. So it was like 15 to 17-year-olds. It was like a summer camp, which I would have loved to have gone to as a child, but I never did. And it was like writer camp. So I got to teach these students. So it was like, you know, lots of like young people. We were having class every single day. And the way that I usually organize my teaching is around genre, because genre is very interesting to me. Tropes are very interesting to me. Like the way that genre sort of functions is like kind of the central part of my teaching. And when I teach all college classes, I usually use genre as like sort of an organizing principle. So we were every day talking about, like, you know, what is horror? What is science fiction? What is fantasy? What's body horror? What is, you know, liminal fantasy? What's immersive fantasy? Like, what's portal fantasy? What's, you know, sci-fi? There's all these like different sort of genres, subgenres. and how do they work, and like how do we know how they're working and what they offer us as readers and as writers. And I was just talking about it so much that I think something kind of just clicked in my brain, and I spent all the time that I wasn't in class just like walking around, just because I had a lot of free time. And at some point I sort of began to think of the contents of this book. I thought of it initially, I was like, oh, what about the Gothic, which is a form that really interests me, this idea of like a woman in like sort of a strange place, this sort of inhabitation, the home, the way that like the location is hostile against a female protagonist, like that. The Gothic was very interesting to me. And also haunted houses are very interesting to me as another sort of genre or subgenre. And so I began thinking about it in those terms, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. But then I was like, oh, but what about like a generationship? What about, and I began to sort of just like meditate on these ideas. And then that was like the key I needed to unlock the materials. So I literally sat down and just wrote, like in this little just journal that I had, I just wrote like tons and tons and tons of like ideas were just pouring out of me. And by the time I left town, I had like hundreds of these, most of which I did not use. I mean, there were so many of them, and most of them ended up either getting folded into something else or didn't get used. But yeah, and so then I had this sort of idea, and then once I did that, like this sort of I've been describing it as like a wet baby giraffe, like fell out of me, like this really like like sort of very young and like gross, and like, but like all the things that it needed were there, just it had to like get bigger. So like I had written this like very, very loose, very bad draft that I ended up selling to my publisher, and then had to like fix it, like make it grow up and like make it be real. Yeah, and then like which ones I chose just really, I mean, I wrote a lot, and like I said, some of them kind of repeated themselves. I mean, this is like true of like, because like there's a lot of overlap in genre, right? So like my editor would be like, hey, like here you have like this one trope and this other trope, and they kind of do the same work. So like, couldn't we just combine them, put them under a single title? And I was like, yeah, you're right. So like, there was a lot of that where I was just like moving things around. And then I ended up with, I think, between like 140-ish like chapters that like, and that just ended up being the ones that survived, that I felt like were doing the most work in terms of like moving the narrative in the way that I wanted it to be moved.
What was the thought process in the ordering of them? Was it sort of a game of literary Jenga or Tetris rather?
So this is extremely embarrassing, but so I wrote them out of order completely. Like I wrote sort of most of the like personal material came first. That was like kind of what I sold. So like when I sold the original version, it didn't really have any of the like history or analysis or anything, because it was just me being like, here's like what I've kind of birthed, and then like I want there to be history and analysis and research that I have to do still. Like I hadn't done it yet, you know? So like initially the book was just like, you know, all of that stuff. And then it was like these lumps of research. So you could see like what I was reading, because I would read much stuff and I'd be like, okay, I have like an idea for this, this, and this. So it was just these like weird sort of heterogeneous chunks. And then at some point my editor, Ethan, who's wonderful and very sweet, was like, okay, so now we need to like put it in order. And I was like, okay. So I sat with it for a few days and almost had a nervous breakdown because I couldn't make it work. I was really struggling to put it, like I just felt like I was moving things around very arbitrarily. And so I called him and I was like in tears and I was like, can you please just put it into order for me? And he was like, yeah, sure. So he did. He like put it into this loose order, and I had to fix a few things when he said, because you know, like when he put it out of order, or when he put it into his own order that in a way that made sense, then some things got kind of chronologically scrambled a little bit. So then I had to fix that. But generally speaking, the order that the book is in order that he put it in. I mean, he's a really amazing editor. Like I felt super lucky to work with him on this book, and it would not be nearly as good without having had his input. And yeah, so the ordering thing was like that was very much him. That's why it's great to have an editor.
What about the Thompson's motif index? This is one of the things that, you know, is one of my favorite parts of this memoir is the footnotes that are citing, you know, these motifs that occur in folktales and fairy tales, right? And was that part of the original conception of the structure? Did that come in later? How did that?
So the Thompson motif, the Thompson, oh my God. Yeah, so there are different folktale indices. Like there's different sort of taxonomies of folktales and fairy tales that exist that different scholars have put together. And some of them are relatively short and small. And this one in particular is extremely long.
Does
So
not seem
I've
small.
actually, it is not small. So I've never seen the physical copy of it. The version that I was working from was digital. Like I had somehow acquired like a PDF of like the entire thing. It was like, which is like over 1,000 pages long. So I think in reality, it's like a multi-volume book set. That's just these like, yeah, it's just these like, it's this one sort of incredibly detailed folktale taxonomy that's like just very granular. So it wasn't part of the original conception. So there's many sections. I really am interested in fairy tales, and I write a lot about fairy tales. And I was researching. There's a section in the book about fairy tales that involve narratives of silence or silencing or like voicelessness. And so I was like trying to find other fairy tales that fit into that category because I knew like a handful of them, but I was like, I bet there's more. So I was trying to use the taxonomy to actually figure out. I was like, oh, what's like other folk tales that involve silencing or whatever. And so I was looking in various places, and then I stumbled across this index, and I was like, oh my God, this is so like beautiful and weird. And like the sections read like poetry. Like there was something really bizarre and beautiful. And I love a list. I find lists very interesting. I love like an index. I don't know. It just really like spoke to me. And so I began to like use it. And because it was so specific, it added this really specific kind of energy when I would like footnote a certain part with the comment. Sometimes it was like descriptive or like categorical. Sometimes it was like a little wry or like ironic. And then in the case of like the section about pregnancy or like mystical pregnancy, it's like this extremely long list of like all the ways in folktales that people have potentially gotten mystically pregnant. And I was just I was just like, it's so weird. It's like impregnation by comet, impregnation by like a glance, impregnation by like, I don't know, melon or whatever. It's like this very weird list. And so, yeah, and then I just ended up kind of using it and I really leaning into it, which is like a real, I mean, it's weird because it's like, it's hard to describe any part of this book as like having been fun to write because it was not fun. But there were parts that were like more pleasurable than others. And that index actually gave me a little bit of levity. Like it gave me a little bit of space to play in a way that I would in fiction, which was a real pleasure because so much of writing this book was difficult and upsetting and stressful. And so that was like a moment where I got to just be like, okay, like let's hunt around in this like long ass document and like find what I need to find.
Yeah. So in the Dream House has been compared most often, if it's being compared to anything, as sort of like an experimental formal cousin to Canoe's Exercises in Style, which also moves between different genres and is formally innovative. And you name check Exercises in Style in a section titled Dream House as Exercise in Style, where you're mentioning a bit coming to the process of fragmentation and formal constraints as a way of better accessing truth, is specifically in your fiction practice, but also in the wake of the trauma of abuse. And I was wondering if there was a similar accessing or approaching truth through these formal constraints and fragmentation in nonfiction.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been really interested in fragmentation as an experimental mode. I think people feel a little like overwhelmed by it sometimes, or like not sure how to read it. And I think a lot of writers are doing really interesting things with fragments and short chapters. And I remember back when I wrote Especially Heinous, which is a story from my first book that involves also a lot of little pieces, my then professor Kevin Brockmeyer describing it as like a scatter plot graph, which is like the only math that I now remember from any like math in my youth. But like the idea that like you have lots of data sort of scattered on a graph, and then there's like a best fit line that moves through it. That's like the average of all the pieces. And I think that actually makes a lot of sense to me, like emotionally, because like in that story, like, you know, there were like pieces that were that were sort of part of like a central narrative, and there's like kind of these weird little one-offs that like just existed sort of by themselves, and like the thrust of the story is like this sort of central truth about, you know, in the case of that story, like sexual violence and narratives of sexual violence and how we consume them. Yeah. So I don't know if it's, I don't think it's like the only way to access truth, but I think for me and for my brain, it was like I didn't know how to write this book until I could write it this way, because it was like a way of me wrapping my head around it, which doesn't mean it's like the only real way in there, just the only way that my brain can make it work. And I mean, like I struggle, like I've never written a novel. You know, I tend to work best in small pieces, at least now. I mean, maybe one day that'll change. I feel like a novel or like a singular long narrative that doesn't have this fragmentation is like just very difficult for me. And so I don't know, like it just feels like a way that for me made it work, and it made me able to access the truth and sort of perceptions about what happened to me, because also the subject is like a subject that like has a lot of sort of weird bits, and like is from a history that's very hidden, and also like is very hidden in society, and like is represented in little pieces here and there, but never like consistently anywhere. So like there were just a lot of things in the book that were reinforced by the fragmented structure. So yeah.
Jumping on the subject of like the hidden histories, and what you are referring to often as archival silence in this memoir. One of the things that this memoir talks about is the really stunning lack of available literature, not just memoir, documenting queer abuse of any kind. And I'm interested to hear more about the process of research in the face of this yawning void of archive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of describing it as like that scene from Contact where Jodie Foster says they should have sent a poet. And I feel like for me, it's like they should have sent a historian, because I am not a historian. I'm not a journalist. Like I don't have the kind of sort of background that I think, and I mean, I say in the book, like this is not meant to be like an exhaustive account of like the research about this representation of this subject through history, because like that's not the kind of writer I am. That's not, you know, and I acknowledge that, and I understand that about myself and about, you know, and I want someone else to like write that book, and I will gladly read it. But for me, I really struggled with like so I just sort of did, I mean, I felt like I was sort of digging blindly into like a lot of material. So like I would read like a legal paper, and then I would like follow a bunch of footnotes in the legal paper, and then I would find some other things, and I would like read it, like, you know, there'd be like a single issue of like a lesbian periodical from the 80s that would be dedicated to this subject, and then I would like follow some of those writers and like what they had written after, you know. So I was just like, it was like I was just sort of shooting in the dark and like digging where I would find little holes and like trying to sort of piece it together. And at some point I had to acknowledge, like, there's a possibility that I fucked this up very badly. There's a possibility that I like missed something very large. Well, I mean, like, and I think that's like a thing that, and it's like, but it was like, you know, it's like because I know this about myself. And I mean, I also like, you know, I contacted Lillian Faderman, who's this like really wonderful lesbian sort of journalist and historian. And I asked her if she sort of had any ideas about like the subject, and she was like, no, weirdly, no, I don't. And that's so interesting. So yeah, so I feel like I did my best, and I was just really, you know, I just sort of followed the resources. And I mean, I wonder if this is sort of how like, historians will like research a thing, and they'll be like I saw this tweet recently that was like, you know, future historians will be asked what month of 2020 they specialize in. You know, and I feel like in that way, it's like, well, I don't know much about many things, but I could tell you like the arc of the conversation about queer domestic violence in the lesbian domestic violence in the lesbian community in the United States between 1980 and like 2010. Like I could tell you about like the way that conversation kind of shifted and moved, and like the various players and the way that conversation was evolving, because I just read, I'm pretty sure, everything that was available within that time frame. But also like the idea of like a battered spouse, and I use that in giant quotes, but like, or they did like an abused woman, is like an idea that's relatively new. Like it's only about 50 years old. Like before 1979, we didn't really have language for that. We didn't have, like, it was just sort of considered a thing that happened. And so you're also dealing with a lot of like silence around like the fact that the subject did not have like a sort of body of work around it or set of ideas, or the fact that also like queer identity was like goes through a lot of cycles, right? And that like in the past, like we didn't really have language for it. It was very hidden, and like there were ways in which we didn't talk about, you know, what it meant that people had queer relationships. So like there's just like levels and levels of invisibility, and like faced with that, I mean, I stand no chance, right? Like I'm a fiction writer, like what do you want from me? But also, yeah, I read all these papers, and I spent like weeks and weeks just researching like everything I could find about the subject, and I feel like I had a handle on like one little piece of it that like gave me some context that I needed for the book.
No, I mean there was another interview where I love the way you phrase this, and I wish I had it written down in front of me, but I think you were referring to in the Dream House as creating a historical text for the future, right? Like, and that this was part of a conversation that you saw extending, you know, far past the, you know, your life, or the life of the conversations that it's addressing currently, and you really wanted it to sort of address, like, extend into the future, which I think is so incredibly beautiful.
Well, I feel like most writing is like, I mean, I think there's ways to think about one's own writing of any type, which is like you are sort of putting this little piece of a bridge into the future, and it goes beyond everything. It goes beyond your own lifetime. It goes beyond geography and language and everything. So in that way, like, you know, I can read a book from like a writer whose language I do not speak, from like the 1800s, and like they've been dead for a long time. They couldn't have even conceived of me as a person, and yet here I am, like having a conversation, or having my half of a conversation that they began like, you know, 200 years ago or whatever. And I feel like that's, I mean, it's like, in a way it's kind of daunting, but it's also kind of freeing, because you're like, I don't know, I will never know in my lifetime, like the scope of the conversation that we had about my own work, and like what that sort of means. And yeah. And so I feel like for this book, like I feel like I've put my little side of the bridge down, and I'm like, you know, people can take this wherever and however they want. And that's it. And there's something very freeing about that. I think it's easy to really dig yourself into a hole about what people think of you and your career and like your blah, blah, you know, whatever. And for me, it's like, well, I mean, I also have those fears as well. I don't want to pretend like I don't have those fears. So I do. But like, I also just feel like it's a very interesting way of thinking about yourself in a little more of a holistic sense, and like across this like vast thing that you could never know. And it's sort of freeing for me.
There's in the prologue of the book that's called Dream House as prologue. You bring up Saidiya Hartman's question, how does one tell impossible stories? And you run through a number of ways that she answers that. What does she say? She's saying how, among other possible avenues, you can imagine what cannot be verified. For example, you can write history with and against the archive. And I mean, because that seems to be something that this text is working with, I was wondering if there was anything that, any way that you would add to or modify her list, because that seems like a conversation that this was very much in tune with.
I mean, I feel like a key word for me that kept sort of recurring in this process is speculative, which often gets used to refer to like speculative fiction, which just sort of means like, you know, fiction that sort of imagines diversions from our reality in various ways, whether it's like near future science fiction or sort of liminal fantasy or whatever. But I think in terms of nonfiction, there are ways it can function. So for example, in the memoir, I have this section called The Queen and the Squid, which is a fairy tale that I wrote because I wanted to include, so there's actually like, so this is like the story of that chapter, which is like, I really wanted to include, so toward the end of our relationship, my ex sent me a series of like large sort of bloviating, dying wizard style emails. And I was very interested in their content and reproducing it in some way in the book. And I knew that I couldn't just like, well, my editor was like, you can't just reproduce someone's correspondence. Like they own the copyright to their own words. So you can't just be like, here's an email I got sent, right? But you can, they can be modified, right? So I was like, okay, so the thing that I did is I took all the emails, I put them into a Word document, I divided them into sentences, like individual sentences, and then I alphabetized the sentences, and then I returned it to like a block.
Oh.
So a very early version of the book had like a footnote that was like the alphabetized sentences of these emails. And like, it was really interesting, like all the sentences that began with the letter I, like the words that repeated themselves, and like the sort of the bloviating mass, like it became evident through this structure, like the sort of the utter nonsense and sort of masturbatory quality of these emails.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting. My editor was like, I feel like we're still like on the line, sort of copyright wise, legally speaking. And I was like, okay. So I was like, okay, so I can't do that. Damn it. All right. So, so I had to find some other way to do it. So like, in this case, I'm being backed against the wall, not by fact, but by this like weird legal quirk, which is like, I can't, even though these letters were sent to me, I can't reproduce them, So I was like, okay, great. So then what I ended up doing was writing a very long fairy tale about a queen and a squid, where I sort of reconstruct the energy and the style and the sort of dynamic between the two characters of the emails, and use some language from the emails in this like very long, very twisted fairy tale. And then my editor was like, okay, sufficiently altered, and I was like, great, okay, perfect. So like in that case, like obviously it's a fairy tale. If you read it, it's like the fairy tale itself did not happen, but the fairy tale is doing work to do a thing that I was restricted from doing.
Yeah.
Right. And so I feel like that's an example of like, and there's also like a section that's like a murder mystery that's like just a story of like a sort of, it's a very classic sort of like the lights go out, somebody is stabbed to death, people are arguing and accusing each other, and then someone slips away and gets away with the murder, right? So like that's obviously like fictional, but it's like being sort of worked in this, it's like this way of like sort of moving toward like a central theme.
So I feel like a book that inspired me or like was part of sort of my process for this memoir was Kevin Brockmeyer's memoir, A Few Seconds of Radiant Film Strip, which is this like really beautiful, sort of very crystalline memoir about 7th grade that he wrote in like, I think I think it came out in like 2012. And there's a section in the book where like time freezes and his older self comes and talks to his younger self. And it's this really beautiful moment of rupture where like, clearly what's happening is non-fictional, like clearly, or is fictional. Clearly what's happening is speculative. It's like, it's time does not stop. You cannot have an older self talk to a younger self. But it's sort of in pursuit of this very sort of keen truth, which is like what a memoir is, which is like your younger self talking to your older self, right? And I was just so moved by it and really surprised by it. And I was like, I didn't know you could do that. And I feel like there's something really magical about that process. So yeah, that book was like really special to me. And I think there's something really interesting about that whole way of thinking about it that just feels like a little more expansive. I mean, obviously I think some people would feel like weird about that, would be like, you can't do that, that's fucked up. But for me, like with the Queen and the Squid, like it just felt like a way of like when you aren't able to do something through truth, you can sort of invoke this obviously fictional device to like get at something deeper. And that to me was just very useful.
That's, I mean, making impossible stories possible, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think we have time for one last question. So I wanted to talk about the larger shifts in genre throughout your career so far. So that's a book of short stories to a memoir to one of the current projects is The Low Woods, which is out from DC Comics currently, and then in compiled and out in September, correct?
Mm-hmm. That's correct.
Yeah, and I'm just interested in you embodying the spaces of all of these genres and how that's been to switch between them.
I mean, I find switching kinds of projects very empowering and exciting and fun. Like I get bored very easily, so I like to switch things up. And DC reached out to me and was like, "Do you want to write a horror comic?" And I was like, "I don't know the first thing about writing comics, but sure, we can like make it work." And it was this really fun project. Yeah. So now all 6 issues are out. The story is done, but there is like a book form of it coming out in September in the States. And it was really cool getting to like write scripts and like collaborate with an artist. And I mean, there are all these things that I had not done before, and like learning lessons about like visual writing. So like, I remember one time, like my editor saying to me, "Okay, so when you write a comic book, you want, if there's like a surprise, like a visual surprise, like someone opens a door and it's like, something's inside. Like you always want the surprise on the even page, because they always start on an odd page. So you want like the reader to turn the page and they're like, whoa, look at that thing. You don't want the surprise on the right, aka the odd page, because then people kind of like spoil it for themselves. Like they'll see it before you're ready." And I was like, oh yeah, that never would have occurred to me in 10,000 years. Like I would never, but that's like a thing just about like writing comics, right? Or like thinking about like when I was writing descriptions of the panels, it wasn't just like, this is happening. It was like, this is happening and you're seeing it through a window, or like this is happening and you're seeing it like behind or inside this, or like from the top, or like, and like all these ways of like thinking about things visually that like, as a prose writer, I generally don't have to think about, or I think about really differently. So yeah, it was like a really challenging project, but super fun. And I loved it. And I got to like turn this like novel that I never started with, which I had tons of notes for, into this like really beautiful comic that I love. And it's like such a cool project, and I'm like really proud to have done it. So yeah, I don't know. I really enjoyed it. I'm interested in, I love comics, and it was like a real pleasure to get to like collaborate with an artist who's like really brilliant, and like and also like the act of like you're imagining things in your head all the time, and then suddenly there's like a drawing of it and it's like exactly what you imagined, and you're like, like what the hell? Like it's so cool. I don't know. I love it. So yeah.
Well, I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for having this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I wish I could be in Berlin. I wish the United States was less terrible about managing illness.
I wish you were here too.
I'll be there soon, Berlin, at some point. I don't know. We'll see. All right.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a conversation with Carmen Maria Machado, author of Her Body and Other Parties, and the memoir that we were talking about, In the Dream House. Enjoy the rest of the 20th Internationales Literaturfestival Berlin.